It looks as though I am recording at the moment. Okay, so please let me know if I'm not recording. It should be recording. Does it look like I'm recording? Just making sure. Okay, cool. All right, awesome. All right, well, today might be an interesting, well, to start off, I will just say that the new homework assignment is up. I changed the due date to be a little later. So this is basically the final homework assignment before your final project. And it's not that different from the previous assignments. I just want to kind of want to see that you have a handle on using some of these effects and that you're playing around with them. Equalization, compression, delay, return track with sends, and then some use of analog, operator, or wavetable, one of those three devices. So with that being said, we could talk a little bit about all of these different things. We've already talked about EQ. I think I explained it a couple of classes now. Compression, there's actually a really cool website that explains compression. Tried my best to explain some of it, but there is this one right here, this animated guide to compression. It's pretty good because it just kind of explains what's going on in a very kind of sequential sort of fashion. Just maybe I could just kind of show you this really quickly. Remember, the idea behind compression, the reason it's so important in your audio tracks is that you want to make your audio a little more even keel. So if certain things in your audio file are kind of poking out, it makes it a little difficult to listen to because you're kind of more conscious of the difference in level, and you kind of just want a smooth listening environment. And if things are not compressed, it's especially difficult to listen to something in a car, for instance, like classical music, because the dynamic range will jump up and down, and the noise floor of the car that you're sitting in kind of makes it difficult to hear the quieter spots. So you have to turn up the volume, and then like when it gets too loud, you have to turn down the volume. So I guess if you're looking for something that's a little more radio ready and sort of a pop rock or hip hop sort of vein, compression is really useful. Whereas a lot of jazz and classical recordings don't use it as much because they like the raw natural sound. But compression, you could lower the dynamic range just by doing automation. So like what this is showing you is you have the waveform and you want to make it more even. You could actually just manually shrink the levels of the waveform. That's something you could totally do, but the result is it can get a little bit tedious. And this is actually something that visually I don't think you can do in Ableton. But you can imagine, you could do this with clip gain if you chopped up clips that way. So for instance, if I have a waveform, let's say, let's see, grab a waveform. What this is basically showing you is the following thing. I could go in, I could take this, I notice this is a little louder than that thing, I can kind of do this, kind of squash it a little bit, do that, and that's basically what the compressor is doing. Downward compression especially is just making everything a little bit softer, so it's just basically doing that. But this is sort of tedious, right? You have to go through and you kind of have to individually make everything a little more even and soft. So the idea behind a compressor is that it automatically figures out how to do this for you. And it does this by looking at the threshold mainly. So essentially what's happening with the threshold, this is, again, it's a review from either last time or 2 times ago, I can't remember now. But it's basically looking at sounds that exceed a certain volume, and then it automatically reduces the volume of the sound at that particular time. So if a sound, for instance, if at this particular time the sound is over this level of volume, the compressor will kick in and be like, let's actually tone this down a bit and just compress it. So that's what the threshold is useful in determining. It's useful in determining what level of sound is necessary for the compressor to actually begin to kick in. Like this wouldn't trigger the compressor because this is actually softer than the threshold. This is lower than the threshold, but this is higher. Pretend there's an imaginary line right here. And this is louder than that. So this is the threshold. It's exceeded the threshold at which the compressor will take effect at that point. So the result is it would get attenuated to some degree. And then again, there's this idea of the attack and the release. So if the attack is really fast, the compressor will behave instantaneously. So it'll actually just like potentially just squash this peak, and then the rest of the sound will still go by just fine. Now, one thing I didn't talk about is the release. And the release is how long it takes before the compressor disengages. So for instance, if you have a fast attack, you might, but you have a slow release, you might find that this entire thing actually gets compressed. Even though you have a fast attack, you have a slow release, meaning the compressor is still going to take a while before it stops compressing, which means all of this will get compressed. But if you only want the attack to get compressed, you have a fast attack and you have kind of a fast release, because the fast release will kind of allow you to disengage the compressor as soon as the peaks are gone. But that's more of an aggressive form of compression because you're only squashing the peaks. Well, you might call it an aggressive form of compression. There's many. It's actually I shouldn't use that word because in some ways by having a longer release, you're actually compressing for longer time. So that's basically how the attack and release work. And there's really cool animations for all this. So the threshold basically determines how much the signal gets attenuated, or attenuated means decreased. How much the signal gets decreased past the threshold. So 1-to-1 means everything past the threshold, 100% of it will end up getting through. If you have 2-to-1, only 50% of the sound that exceeds the threshold will get through. If you have 4-to-1, only 25% of the sound that passes the threshold will get through. And infinity to 1, as you approach infinity, none of the sound that passes the threshold will get through. So that's this. As you get further and further along this graph, you get into more and more high ratios. You get to the realm of limiting instead of compressing, because you're literally just squashing it to nothing. Anything past the threshold to nothing. Or I guess you're squashing everything past the threshold to the level of the threshold is what I should say. You're not squashing it to nothing, you're just bringing it to the threshold. So the consequence of this is if you lower the threshold and you have the ratio really high, it's going to squash everything to the threshold, which is really low, which will basically make the sound disappear. So I guess a really useful case for this is exactly what I've described. If you have a sound, especially an audio file, because audio files, if you're singing, for instance, or you're playing guitar, you're going to find that the things that you produce yourself on your own that don't come from a sample pack are going to come in a little uneven at times. It's not going to be as even. You might like move closer to the microphone, and all of a sudden you're closer to the microphone, and the result is the sound is louder at that particular instance, and you move away from the microphone and the sound is softer. So you have to make these kind of corrective adjustments. So it's really useful for that purpose. So makeup gain is basically this idea that as you compress something, you actually make it softer. You might not immediately know this because a lot of the compressors that you work with seem to make everything louder. But that's because they're using makeup gain. Basically, makeup gain means that you're taking into account how soft you made something, and then you're boosting it to make it appear as loud as it was before. But it's actually going to feel louder as a result of what you just did. So don't get confused. A compressor actually does make things softer, but you are inadvertently hearing it as louder because the result of making everything, by making it more even keel, is that you can actually push up the volume. So the average volume of the track actually gets louder, but the peak volume actually stays the same to some degree. Yeah. So the peaks get squashed, and they get more and more leveled, but the average level actually increases, giving you this perception that the sound is actually getting louder. Yeah. Oh yeah, it says that the higher average volume will make the whole signal seem louder. What is this? So the knee essentially determines the compression near the threshold. So you might have compression only past the threshold, or you might have a little bit of compression near the threshold. It's sort of blending, it's sort of blurring the line of where, quite literally and figuratively, it's blurring the line of where the threshold really is. It's saying, is the threshold here? Oh, or is the threshold here? And it's sort of expanding the scope of the threshold. So you can kind of have a more gradual kind of feeling, compression. So we talked about attack. Oh, look at this. This is nice. So a fast attack, it's going to say, gotcha, right? Fast attack. Gotcha. Okay, that's a fast attack, but a faster release. This is a fast attack and a slow release. It's attacking right away, but then it's, or actually, no, this is actually a slow attack. Okay? This is a fast attack. It happens right away. The compressor engages right away. This is a slower attack because the compressor does engage all the way, but it takes a little while to get there. Now it's compressing right away. It's taking a second. This is a slower attack time. So this has nothing to do with release yet. Okay? Okay, so this is the release, okay? So what this graph is showing you is basically, this is a very quick release. This dial is showing you the release time. Quicker, slower. Longer release times, slower release time. Faster, slower. So this compressor is disengaging really, really slowly. So over here, compressor is disengaging. Now it's disengaging more slowly. Now it's disengaging really slowly. Even though so the idea is the compressor drops below the threshold, it doesn't disengage immediately. The idea is that it disengages over time, and that's what the release determines. So an important consideration for release time is you might have a situation where you have a lot of drum beats and you want to compress the transients of each drum beat, right? So let's say you have these drum beats, right? You have this and you want to compress this, but you want to leave this alone. But then you want to compress this, but you want to leave this alone. So I guess maybe I can color code this. I'll color code this yellow. So I want to compress this, but I want to leave the other thing alone. I want to compress this, but I want to leave this alone, right? By the way, to consolidate a clip, you can press Command J, and now it's consolidated. It's the opposite of cutting, Command E, Command J. Okay, so let's say I want to compress this, but I want to leave this alone. So what would I have to do? I'd have to have a fast attack time, and then I would have to have a fast release, right? Because I'd have to engage the compressor quickly, and then I'd have to disengage the compressor relatively quickly, right? And then I want to engage the compressor again quickly, and then I want to disengage the compressor relatively quickly, right? But what if I engaged the compressor really quickly, but then I disengaged it really slowly? well, then all of this would get compressed, right? So that's probably not what you want, because you want to feel the pulsing of the music. You want to feel the dynamic of the drum, but what you'll end up hearing is like da, 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 instead of da, 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 right? You don't want the release time to be too slow, right? If you make the release time too slow, you'll just you'll compress in a way that you'll release the compressor in a way that doesn't sync up with the beats of the music. So the compressor is kind of dynamic and kind of engages and disengages with the music, right? So for instance, you could have something like this where it's like, this is kind of periodic, engage, disengage, engage, disengage, engage, disengage, engage, disengage. It gives the music a certain feel, right? But if you're just engaging it and you're not disengaging, then it's just going to feel like engage, and then all the stuff will sound compressed, and you'll say, why doesn't this sound punchy? I was trying to make this sound punchy by making this, this is not a way to make this sound punchy. If these were drums, this wouldn't be, but I was trying to make this work a certain way, and it's only working the way I'm expecting for this first hit, and that's because you're not setting the release correctly. So release times are a little bit, you could calculate them by actually thinking about how much time you have to, how much time is involved in basically before you have to re-engage it again. You could look at the timeline and be like, okay, well, in the bottom, I don't know if you can see this, I can't actually scroll my mouse, because if I scroll the mouse, it disappears. But this is where I want you to look. So you're looking down there, and then you see the duration. You see some sort of time code, right? You can kind of use that as some sort of basis for the release time. Or you could actually do this thing. Ableton has this in its built-in compressor. I can show you what I mean. Where there's actually an auto release function. So you don't actually have to think about it. It'll kind of intelligently know when to release the compressor. It'll release it before the next attack, essentially. So that is basically, it's important to know that. But if you have the release really affects the sustain of the note, because it, the compressor is still engaged. The sustain of the note is really affected severely. The attack of the note is presumably already compressed, unless you have a slower attack time. So this is basically, I think these are the basic ideas. And we talked about sidechain compression. And this idea that you could compress, you could use another signal to compress. You could use the volume of one signal to compress another signal. So it's like this drum is going bum, 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 and then as a result, you're carving out that in another signal. So you're like, oh, this drum is this loud at this point. I'm going to make my bass that much softer at this point, sort of thing. So it's sort of a complementary relationship. Sidechaining is a complementary sort of thing. You're allowing the parameter of one thing to inversely affect the parameter of another thing. I think that's worth talking about just one more time, sidechain compression. Again, whenever I talk about compression, I feel like I'm really compressing it. So I guess, what more could you expect? So I guess before I talk about sidechain, I don't want to get off on a sidechain right now. We'll talk about peak versus RMS. Peak, remember, is the instantaneous loudness of any signal. The RMS is the root mean square. It's the average volume. So let's just read this sentence and see what they're saying about this. So RMS more resembles how we perceive volume. We don't actually hear transients. The average level of volume is what we actually feel. So practically, this means that a transient, highly dynamic signal, like a closed hi-hat, will not be read as loud as a more sustained sound, open hi-hat, even if they have equal peak amplitude, which kind of makes sense. It's saying that the peak amplitude isn't the only thing you care about, because if you have a very loud sound that only occurs for one instant, that's not going to feel as loud as if you have a sound that's not as loud that exists over a longer time frame. So I guess so when people talk about sequencing compressors, like if they have two compressors in series, you could use, what this article is saying is it's saying that you could use a peak compressor, a compressor in peak mode, where you basically have peak, to chop off the peaks, just the extraneous kind of bursts of sound. And then you use an RMS compressor. You use the RMS mode to basically average, to do more with making the average volume more even. Because once you chop off the peaks, you're in a better position to kind of play around with the averages. But these peaks might throw off the averages in some weird way. So I mean, for instance, if you took away the peaks, they have quite a substantial, you know what, I'm going to use 0. I don't think I've told you about the command 0. 0 is such a cool command. It's one of my favorites. It deactivates a clip. So check this out. As I take away these peaks, notice how, because they're so loud, they actually substantially alter the average volume of the clips we're working with. So once you kind of handle those, you might be in a better position to kind of do more averaging using the RMS mode. So a lot of people will do, in other words, a lot of people will do something like this. They'll have a peak compressor, they chop off the peaks, then they'll have an averaging kind of compressor. You could do something like that if you really want to even out the sound. It's a very logical thing to do. So that is a lot about compression. And I'll put this link on the OneNote. So if I go to recording, I think it's under mixing, compression. Okay, so I guess what I'll do is I'll put this right here. Cool explanation. Okay. And all this stuff is kind of explained, but I like these animations. I think they really are nice. So, and I can't embed animations in this, but I'm working on a website where I can actually do that. So anyway, let's talk about sidechain compression. This idea that the volume of one can kind of complementarily cause the other to get softer. So for instance, I guess what I'll do is, by the way, do you see when I'm zooming in when I do this, or you don't see this? No one sees that? Okay. I'm using like the Mac system zoom. It's fun to do that, but I can't do it now. Okay. Anyway, so just to kind of recap what sidechain compression is and how you would use it. If I take a track, let's say I take that particular drum track that I just had. I'll just start from scratch. I'll just delete it. I'll look in my samples, and I'll go into a drum loop. Nice. Okay. I'll drag this into right here. Ooh, sorry, it's a little hot. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to need something to sidechain this with. So I'm going to grab a bass part, okay?
I don't think you have Zoom audio selected because we're only hearing it through your speakers.
Oh, really? Okay. Let me try that again. Thank you for letting me know. Oh, yes. Okay. Oh. Great. Zoom audio. Okay. You guys can hear that now? Yes?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. Great. So I have this little track right here. I need something to sidechain this with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, let's see. You know what? This might be an opportunity to use this device that I have open already. So I have this little wavetable device. I will create a MIDI clip. I forgot what this sounded like. Turn on preview mode. By the way, if you want to use the button, if you want to use this little draw mode, you could press B. It's a shortcut. But this draw mode, this pencil, just kind of goes, it coincides with whatever grid size you're currently on. So another really useful use for command 1 and 2. Okay. So I'm going to make this even bigger. Even bigger. Okay, so I got this little thing right here. Okay, so now what I'm going to do, just to kind of reiterate what you could do with this, is I could take, essentially what I'm trying to do in this situation is compress this sound whenever something here occurs. In fact, normally what I would do is I would only perhaps do it when the kick drum comes in, but this is an audio clip instead of a MIDI clip, so we'll just have to work with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag a compressor. The reason, I mean, it's not so much a problem that's an audio clip versus a MIDI clip. It's a problem that all these drums are combined as one audio clip instead of separate audio clips. So a better thing to do might actually be create a little drum rack. Actually, this is a perfect. There's something I want to mention today, so this is perfect. Okay, I'm going to bring in a drum rack, and I'm going to pull up a good old maybe an 808, or maybe a 909. Okay, I'll bring my little 909 in here. And what I'm going to do is first, am I actually getting drums? Oh, oops. Okay, well, I'm just going to record something really quickly. I wonder if the latency is terrible. Let's see. You know what? I want to turn on my metronome. Okay, let's see. So I've got something right there. And I guess I can quantize it by using my good old shortcut Command U. In case you didn't know that shortcut, it's Command U. Okay, so I quantized it. I was at the correct grid setting, so it worked out just fine. So now I've got a bass drum. So sometimes things cut out when the bass, the kick drum. It's the same thing, but the bass drum or the kick drum is basically the same thing. It's this sound right here. Okay. So what I could do is I could make it so that this particular sound of the wavetable actually cuts out every single time this kick drum actually plays. So in order to do that, just to make things a little easier to follow, I'm going to say this will be compressed. To compress, okay? Just so you know, just so you're clear on what's actually being compressed. And this right here is the thing causes compression, okay? So the drums right here are causing the compression, and this right here is what is being compressed, okay? So I'm going to drag on a compressor because I want to compress this. And, okay, so I dragged on a compressor. And what I have to do is I have to engage this. Let me reorient these zoom windows. Okay. So what I have to do is I have to engage the sidechain mode. Okay. So I engage I can basically expose the controls right here. I click sidechain, and we're basically there's a sidechain input now. And we're basically side-chaining the kick from this thing that causes the compression, from this drum track that causes the compression. We're side-chaining the kick drum from that particular track. So when I say audio from, I want to choose the causes compression track. And specifically, I want to choose my kick drum. And what this refers to, pre-effects, post-effects, and post-mixer, it refers to where where in the signal chain we want to grab the kick drum from. Do we want to grab it before any effects are processed on it? Do we want to grab it after the effects are processed on it? Or do we want to grab it after the effects and after the fader level of it? So in this particular case, I don't have a strong feeling, but I guess I'm going to use post effects, meaning that if I change the volume of the mixer, it won't affect the sidechain compression. So what you probably want is post effects. Okay. So I've chosen post effects, which means that now, rest assured, even if I change the volume of this particular track, which causes the compression, it won't affect the it won't affect the amount of compression that occurs on this track. So let's actually see what happens now. Let's actually loop this. Keep the compressor open if I can. Okay, there's nothing happening. You might think there's something happening. There's actually nothing happening. The reason there's nothing happening is because the threshold isn't low enough for anything to happen. Right now, there's no gain reduction. Remember, this middle knob, this middle thing right here shows how much gain reduction is happening on the compressor. Nothing's being reduced. This particular sound that should be compressed is actually not getting compressed. So let's lower the threshold. I lower the threshold to an obscene amount, and now you can hear this kind of cutting in and out, right? It's a complementary sort of relationship. This particular thing gets loud, this particular thing gets soft. Right? So this is a very classic use for this technique to kind of create a pumping effect. But there's even more of there's even more you could do with this. This is actually a really great segue to talk about groups and instrument groups, or instrument racks. But for now, let's talk about groups. So let's say I have something like another track where I have something over here, where I have some sort of piano thing. Right? Let me see if I can actually do this. I'll record it. Right? So I have something right here, right? I have to change the quantization setting so it's a little more sensible. Command U. No, that's not what I want. Incidentally, if you select a bunch of MIDI notes and you hold down Option, you can duplicate them really quickly. It's a useful one. So what I want is this. Okay. All right, sorry guys, to get this MIDI just right. All right, so let's say I had this little thing and I actually wanted it to compress, right? I wanted the kick drum to cause this particular, I wanted this bass to get compressed. So I'm just gonna rename this back to the bass, but I also wanted these chords to get compressed. And I want to compress them both at the same time. This is something that is quite common. You might end up wanting to do the sidechain compression over multiple elements instead of just one element. How do you compress both of these things at the same time? It's not immediately apparent how you would do this, right? Because you have the compressor on one of the tracks. There are a few ways you can do this. You could copy this compressor over to every other track you want compression on. So you could say, I want a compressor on my bass track. I want the sidechain compression to happen on my chords track. There's nothing saying that you can't do that, right? Right now it's compressing both of those things, right? But there's actually a I think, what I would say a better way to do this. And the way to do that is by using groups. So for instance, if I know that if I want to treat these two things with the same amount of processing, I can select these two things, press Command G, or right click is not working, or I can right click and click group tracks. And now I've got a group. Now both of these tracks, this, I guess I'll call this chords again, right? This is chords. Both the chords and the bass are going to a group called everything else. Oops, didn't want to delete that actually. And actually, this is what I wanted, not that. Okay, whatever, right? Oh, I deleted my MIDI. Did I? No, I didn't. Okay. So essentially what's happening here is now my chords, and I'll maybe change this to a different color so you can see it a little better. So both of these things, this chord track and this bass track, are both under the jurisdiction of this everything else track. Meaning if I lower this everything else track, right? You can kind of see how they're sort of, this is like the parent for these two children tracks, right? So essentially, if I want to do this, this is very handy because you can apply processing all at once on all of these tracks at the same time. Incidentally, if you want to bring a fader or any kind of knob back to its original position, you just press delete and it goes back to its original position. So anyway, so now let's actually take this compressor and put it on this everything else track. And let's expose that sidechain control. And we want sidechain input to be the causes compression track, right? And you want the kick drum to be post effects. And now this will behave in a more straightforward way where you only have one instance of this compressor, and it might be a little easier to organize this way. Right? So, can't hear it. Oh, okay, I'm just looking at really old chats. Okay. So essentially, this is a useful thing to know how to do, grouping tracks. And notice how the routing changes. We were talking about input routing, but actually every single audio and MIDI track actually has an output routing, an audio output routing. And so over here, you see chords going to everything else, and you see bass going to everything else. If I ungroup this by pressing Command Shift G, or no, that's not the command. No, it is Command Shift G. It's just not working for me, whatever reason. Option Command G? No, that's not it either. Oh, you have to select the actual group, not the tracks itself. So you select the group, you right click it, ungroup tracks. And notice how the routing changes. Before, the audio was going to everything else, but now the audio is going to master. So let's take a look at this. Here, the audio is going to everything else for these two tracks. And now here, the audio is going to master. Just one more time for you guys to really get that. All right, everything else? Master. Just like that, it's magic, right? Well, all right, I think you guys have seen enough of that. But this is useful. This is very useful for routing purposes because you might decide to actually compress these two things together. You might actually decide that you want to apply a compressor on both of these two tracks at the same time. One thing I do actually on my tracks is I have my vocals separate from every other track. And then I group everything else except my vocals. And then I put a compressor on everything else, and I do the sidechain technique. And what that allows me to do is it allows my track to not interfere with my vocals, because my vocals will get blurred otherwise. And this is a technique I use all the time. It's like one of my favorite techniques. So if you have, let's say I'll do something. Let me grab something. Let me take this and let me call this vocal. And right. I mean, I don't think I need to go into it. I think you guys get the idea. Basically, that's one thing that I would do. I would basically, I'm doing exactly what I'm doing here, but I would just, instead of this, you can imagine this. So this right here would be the vocal. And this right here would be everything else. And you're basically compressing everything else whenever the vocal reaches a certain threshold. The consequence of this is that it's nice. It kind of gives a little space to the vocal. You might not want to EQ you might not want to apply the compression over the entire frequency range. You might want to just apply it over the range of frequencies that's kind of most salient to the vocals. The mids most often get lost in a mix with the vocals. So you might want to just put the filter to be bandpass so that it essentially only the side chaining only affects the mids of the particular sound. So the lows are left untouched and the highs are really left untouched. And you can actually experience different degrees of compression if you do that. And if you play around with this frequency knob, you can kind of affect what kind of filtering actually occurs to your signal. But I really like it if you're, it's just a really quick way to do it. Just make space for the vocals. I'm one of those people that has a really difficult time understanding lyrics. So I'm like one of those people that just like, I always put this on because I'm just used to like Billy Joel, and I like that like crisp, clear New Jersey delivery because I grew up in New Jersey. And so personally, people might listen to something I've made and they might think, oh, the vocals sound a little enunciated, or you can hear them quite well. That's just my own personal preference, but other people have different preferences. But if this is something that you kind of obsess over and you can't quite figure out how to get your vocals to kind of cut through the mix a little more, this is kind of a quick, dirty way to do it. But you can imagine, oh yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Is there any information on side chaining on the OneNote? Because I was looking for it under compression, but I couldn't find anything.
I don't think there is, unfortunately, but I will add that. I'll add that. That's a good thing to add. So I think I'll keep it under mixing, side chain compression. All right. All right. Yes. Speaking of which, if there's any requests on a particular topic that I've talked about that I haven't quite been able to assimilate to OneNote so far, please let me know. I'm trying my best, but some things are a little slower to get assimilated. This thing just has it's an exponential curve. It's funny. You start this project and you're like, oh, this gets pretty deep pretty quick. So I will try to prioritize those things that you want me to prioritize. But I'm trying to do my best to assimilate this as quickly as I can. But sidechain, definitely a confusing topic, but a very useful topic. So worth knowing about. So this is the concept of groups, but there are some other ways of grouping things that we haven't talked about. We've talked about drum racks, and actually this might be a good time to just explain that thing I wanted to tell you just a little bit earlier, because it's a good foray into racks in general. Racks expose all these controls. Like we've talked about how chains basically in a rack are pertaining to all the different instruments that are in that particular device. So this drum rack has access to all these different instruments, and you can map these instruments onto selected squares. You can map multiple to one square. So you can actually have an infinite number of chains, right? There's a finite number of cells. There's only 128 cells, but there's an infinite number of chains that you could have, because you could have many to one, for instance, many chains to one cell. There is something that's pretty interesting about this. We've talked about the receive and play, meaning like if you set the MIDI receive to be the same as something else, one of these squares will become a multi, right? I'm going to back up for a second really quickly. I'm going to make this all unexposed, okay? I see my good old drum rack over here. We're going to talk about macro controls, but not yet. I see my chain list. I click this and I say, here are all the chains, right? In fact, let me simplify this even more. Start from scratch. I'm going to click my chain list, and you see all the different instruments that are available, right? You see the instruments, you see the kick, and you see that it's mapped to this particular cell. You see the rim shot, it's mapped to this particular cell. You see the snare and you see the clap seem to be both mapped to this particular cell. Now, how did that happen? Well, the way that happened was you had to open up the input-output routing. And what that essentially allows you to do is it allows you to map a chain or an instrument into a particular cell. So the reason you have both of these on the same cell is because they're both mapped to the same MIDI note, D1, which corresponds to this cell right here. And that's basically it, as far as that's concerned. But that's what the receive refers to. The play refers to what actual pitch is getting played at that particular instant. So C3, the reason these were all set to C3 is because C3, if I play this on my keyboard, whoops. Oh, I can't actually. If I play all these pitches, if I play all these samples, C3 is the pitch where this sample is untransposed, meaning this sample sounds like the sample was originally pitched at. But if I change if I change play to something really high, notice how the pitch of that sample changes, right? Right? So it's basically setting the pitch. The reason C3 is a significant thing, that's middle C in Ableton's land. So it's basically saying middle C on the piano means that the sample is the same pitch that it originally was. But if I change this, I can actually change the sample to be really, really low in pitch, or really, really high in pitch, or really, really middle in pitch, which is what it starts out as, right? So that's what this play refers to. Choke is a very interesting thing. What choke really refers to is this idea that you can only play, if you set it up correctly, you can only play one instrument at a time. So for instance, any drummers in the class say, yeah. Yeah, all right, cool. So there's some drummers in the class, maybe. But you can kind of conceptually imagine, if you have a drum set, you can't play, okay, I'm gonna pull up a hi-hat picture right here. So this is a hi-hat. This is where, like, you know, when people go, tss, 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 tss. That wasn't a very good sonification of this. But a hi-hat, basically, it's an instrument that looks like this. This one's a little short for some reason. Let me look up it looks like this. And what you can do is you can press the hi-hat down, but you could also slap this when it's open. It has a different sound when it's open than when it's closed. But you can't have the open sound and the closed sound at the same time. That's impossible, right? So you might be in a situation where you want to hit the hi-hat, and then you want to hit the open hi-hat and then close it. But you don't want the open hi-hat to sound when the hi-hat closes, right? Because that's physically impossible. So what choke groups allow you to do is basically allow only one thing to play at the same time. So actually, all these drum kits are actually programmed in that way. Like hi-hat and open and closed are in the same exact choke group. It just comes that way because Ableton was smart about it. They said, well, that's probably the way people want it, so we're going to do that. And what that means is, let me actually see if I can play this. Let's see. Whoops. Notice how this open hi-hat sound is. If I play it quickly, notice how it completely shuts off right when I play the closed hi-hat. So open, right? If I change this choke group to none, notice how you still hear the lingering open hi-hat. So this might be something, especially if you're making your own drum kits, this is something worth investigating, right? Anyway, I wanted to tell you that before I forgot to tell you that. That's what this choke group refers to. So we've looked into these kind of things, where we're looking at the chain, and then we're looking at, we got a little off the chains when we talked about the choke group. But we have the input-output selection right here. We've got other things. We've got the sends and receives, which basically, you can drop an audio effect here, like a compressor, or let me check out the chat really quickly. Why do you have to put choke on both? The reason you have to put choke on both is because they have to all be in the same group. Because it needs to know that when basically by being in the same group, it ensures that these drums can't ever be played simultaneously. So as soon as this is on, this will shut off. It's like a round robin kind of thing. If you don't put choke on both, this one will never have an awareness of this. Okay, says the chat. Okay, great. It's funny, every time I look at the chat, I open it up. Okay, and then I see something surprising. It's like I like it. I just wish they would expose it on the interface so I don't have to keep closing it. Because my screen real estate right now is so inefficient. Like I just see like half the screen is covered with Zoom stuff right now. But anyway, it is what it is. So, so for instance, you could drag a reverb onto this particular, into this little area right here. And going on. Oh, there we go. And now what's happening is basically I could actually set it so that I could send copies of any of these drums to this reverb to be processed within this drum rack. So I could, like, if I want the kick drum to be really reverberant, I could do that. Like, what's useful about this is I could actually expose individual levels of control over these particular values. But I don't want to get too ahead of myself. Let's just, this should really be multiple classes, so let's just pretend that this is an advanced topic, and we'll move on to something else. We'll move on to groups in general and macro controls. Now this is where it gets really powerful, okay? You're gonna find a lot of times that when you open up an instrument in Ableton, that, like for instance, I'm just gonna randomly open an instrument and see if this works out the way I'm expecting it to. Yeah, look at this. You open it, this is an instrument, but you're not seeing the device. You're just seeing these 8 knobs. But actually there is an instrument here. This is actually, what this is actually not a drum rack. It's actually an instrument rack. And an instrument rack is very similar to a drum rack because you see the chains, right? You can see all the different chains available to you. You could see the actual device itself, right? On the drum rack, you could do that as well. But you actually don't, it's actually less, like a drum rack is a good thing to study because it's actually the hardest kind of rack, one of the most difficult kind of racks to understand. But let's say I drag this over here, like just for context, I open a drum rack, I shut off every single thing. And now if I open up the device view, I can actually see what the particular drum looks like at any given time, right? If I open up the chain view, I can see like all this routing, and I can close the input and output routing and all this stuff, right? But ultimately, I want to see the instrument at any given time. Like for all these cells, I want to see the instrument, right? So what this is essentially the same thing. If I click the device, I basically see the actual device that's in this kind of instrument rack. But if I click this, I can kind of see how many instruments are in this rack. What this means is I can actually drag multiple instruments here. So for instance, so let's say I want to do this from scratch. What I would do is I would go to instruments, and I would go to instrument rack. And then what I would do is it would prompt you to drop an instrument or sample here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to follow those directions, and I'm going to drop an instrument or sample. Drop an instrument or sample. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to drop it right here. And now I've got an operator, okay? So exciting, right? So now I've got an operator here. And now what I'm going to do, in fact, I'm just going to take a cool preset. All right, that was cool. That was a little too cool. I'm gonna take this right here. Okay, I'm gonna lower the Q volume a little bit. It's a little loud for me. Okay, I'm gonna take this, and notice how this is an instrument rack, right? So I'm gonna take this sound, but let's say I want to layer this sound with another sound. I want to layer this sound with some other like mallet sound. Now I get both sounds at the same time. Let's say I want to take this sound and combine it as well. Now I get this combination of all three sounds. So that's cool, right? So this is basically allowing you, this is the chain view, remember. This is, wait a second, what's going on? Okay, yeah, this is the chain view. And what the chain view is allowing you to see are all the different instruments that are available to you. Now, in an instrument rack, they're all mapped. They're all sounding simultaneously, unless you do some fancy stuff. But you could adjust the volume of them relative to one another. So you could like make this sound a little softer, this sound a little softer. You can maybe do the inverse. Make this sound a little soft. Right? Right? So you might find that, oh, this sound is a little overpowering, so I just want a tiny bit of it. Or this sound is a little too underpowered, so I want a little more of it. So an instrument rack is really useful in that regard. It allows you to play with these things in a very robust way. So that's what an instrument rack does at the most basic level. But there's actually something else that's really significant. We've talked about devices, right? There's devices. And what's crazy about this, what's crazy about Ableton is that this is actually a rack within a rack. So this is an instrument rack within an instrument rack. So if that doesn't hurt your brain, power to you. But my brain just hurt a little bit just thinking about that. So let's pretend that, let's just make this a little simpler. I'm going to get rid of Squeaky Bell. Oh my gosh, all of these are instrument racks within instrument racks. Okay, so, okay, this is also an instrument rack within an instrument rack. Well, you know what? Instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, what I will do is do the following. You can always ungroup an instrument from its rack by doing that right-click thing. Wait a second. No, that's not it. Yeah, I mean, I guess the way you can ungroup this is just by dragging this over here, and then it no longer exists in that whole ecosystem, right? So just to make things a little, oh gosh. Sorry, I'm trying to think of a really simple example. So let's just do this. Let's just think of a really simple example. There are three instruments I want to talk about today anyway, so why not just talk about them, and in this context. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up an operator, or I'm going to pull up an analog, because this is actually a good one to start with. An analog is a very powerful synthesis instrument. And what it basically allows you to do is it's kind of additive / subtractive synthesis is what analog is really doing, which means that you're basically adding sounds together, or you're subtracting them by filtering the sounds. And so that's why this is under the additive subtractive modality of synthesis. And what I mean by that is there's this oscillator section right here. And within this oscillator section, you actually have these parameters where you can choose a specific type of waveform. So this particular type of waveform that you can choose one of four types of waveforms. You can choose a sine wave, a triangle wave, square wave, or a noise wave. Okay, those are the four types of waves in oscillator 1. But what you could do is you could turn on oscillator 2 and you can get those same exact waves in oscillator 2, and the end result is that this particular device will add the two sounds together. That's what makes this additive synthesis, because you're basically adding this kind of synthesizer. It's two synthesizers within one. You have an oscillator here, you have an oscillator here. So just to drive this point home a little bit, I have this little oscillator. Awesome, right? I've got this sound right here, right? And it's basically right now a square wave, but let's go to a sine wave. So what I want you to do, what I want you to become familiar with is what these waveforms actually look like. They look like this, but let's actually process what that looks like in real time. So if I look up, I have this handy dandy free plugin that you could get called M-Oscilloscope. And what you can do is you can see right here, this is a sine wave. I've just turned on oscillator 1. I left oscillator 2 off, right? And you see a sine wave, right? Beautiful. Uh-oh, right? Well, you basically see a sine wave until I let go of it, and then the analyzer gets confused. Let's say I choose a triangle wave. Looks like a triangle, right? Let's choose a analog sound tip is to detune one of the two oscillators by just a tiny bit. That's a great suggestion, actually. We'll talk about that in a moment. This is a square wave. Now, actually, this isn't quite a square wave. Right now, this pulse width setting is set to 50%. Now it's a perfect square wave. Right? Sounds familiar, right? This right here is a square wave. It looks like a square. And couldn't help myself. All right, so anyway, here is a square wave. Now check this out. If I basically take this width control all the way down here, it's basically adjusting the proportion of the widths of the compression part of the wave and the rarefaction part of the wave. So at 100%, the wave is a normal square wave. The compression portion is the same width as the rarefaction portion. But at 0%, the pulse is no longer even. The compression is much smaller than the rarefaction. So this is what pulse width modulation is. And pulse width modulation, if you notice this, check out this parameter, check out this part of the screen right here. As I change the different waveforms, this option disappears. So pulse width modulation only exists for square waves because you're basically changing the pulse, the width of these two equally widthed. These two pulses have equal. This pulse is constituted of two width components, and you're basically changing the proportion of those width components. Right? At 100%, that's a perfect square wave. So So anyway, this is what the oscillator is doing. This is just basically making a sound wave that has this kind of shape, and it's repeating it a certain amount of times per second, and that's how you get a particular frequency. These are the different waveforms that you could use for this particular device. You could also, as you look at this particular section, it also exposes certain controls regarding the envelope of the pitch. So notice how right here, if you remember what envelope is, it's basically a trajectory of a particular parameter. It's a trajectory of a parameter that uses lines and curves. So right here, what this is saying is the pitch is going to start really high and then it's going to drop. So you kind of have this like laser kind of sound, right? These parameters map to these parameters. So you can kind of change it this way or you can change it this way. Makes me want to play video games. Okay, so you have this particular situation where you can modulate the pitch using an envelope. Now, what else you can do is you can use an LFO. An LFO, we've talked about these kind of concepts in the context of simpler, right? But we've never talked about these concepts in the context of a synthesizer that uses an oscillator, meaning we've never derived sound from a pure waveform before. We've only derived sound from more complex waveforms, like the actual waveform of a drum sound or of you singing. But we've never used a really, really simple waveform to drive synthesis until now, at least in this class lecture format. So this is all those, but what's good to know is that all of these different techniques are really, you can understand them through the context of so many different types of synthesizers that exist within Ableton. So if you understand what an LFO is in simpler, it's you can extrapolate what an LFO does in analog. Now, an LFO, what it stands for is low frequency oscillator. That's what an LFO is. Okay? So what this means is you're basically adjusting a parameter using an oscillator at a slow kind of speed. And in this particular case, we're adjusting the pitch over time using this shape. Okay, so the pitch is going to go it's going to be kind of that kind of thing. If the pitch is going to go up and then down and then up and down over this sine wave. You don't have to use pitch, but in this particular synthesizer, you use pitch. You could use loudness. You could use brightness. You could use darkness. I don't know. You could use all kinds of different things. But in this particular synthesizer, the way that it's laid out, we're in the pitch section. So it's saying, let's modulate the pitch using this shape, the LFO. And you say, dandy, let's do it. I'm game, right? I'm going to do it. But nothing happens, right? Let me actually turn this back to 0. And you get sad. You say, I swear I've turned this up all the way to the max and nothing's happening. Well, you got to turn on the LFO itself. Because right now the LFO is theoretically controlling it to its maximum, but it's off right now. So let's turn on the LFO. Ooh, when we turn on the LFO, we change to a different menu. Let's go back to this menu, and now notice how it's orange. Right? And you get this sort of pitch dizzy, ooh, that's a cool graph. You get this sort of like dizzying sort of sound, right? That's because the LFO is sort of set to be this very dramatic sort of thing. Well, it's not just the LFO that's set to a dramatic thing. I've set this LFO to control a lot of this pitch. I could set it to control less of the pitch. if you want something kind of lo-fi, sometimes it's kind of cool to have a very, very small amount of pitch warble, right? You might want something like, and it kind of gives it this like kind of like, cool lo-fi vibe, right? It's kind of a cool little effect. This is actually similar. This reminds me of something Vuk talked about with the detune effect. By kind of dirtying up the sound just a little bit, you kind of have this cool kind of effect. You probably don't want to do this. But maybe you do. It's kind of cool. I'm kind of open to all kinds of things the more I listen to music. And you might want to use that for more of an experimental portion of your piece, but just a gentle amount of LFO stuff just gives it a little bit of this kind of, like a tape. You can imagine a tape machine kind of slowing up and speeding down, and it's kind of has this kind of undulating kind of warble and pitch. So that's something you can use the pitch mod for. Just a taste. What this sub and sync does is it basically allows you to adjust how much sub frequency occurs. So let me turn this back to 0. Actually, I could, yeah. Now if I turn up the sub, I'm adding basically an octave below it. Right? Incidentally, you could also double click to reset a value as well, but you could press delete also. If you change this sub mode to sync mode, instead of adding lower tones, you actually add upper harmonics. So cool, right? Okay. Basic breakdown of the synthesizer is you have an oscillator, right? You have this control over the pitch. You can change the shape. You can change the octave. You can detune it a little bit. Again, the detune, we haven't talked about the other oscillator yet, but we can turn on another oscillator with it the same waveform. And you could detune one of them against the other one. You can kind of get this kind of gritty texture. It's a really cool, effective technique, just to detune one oscillator against another oscillator. It wasn't exactly what I was expecting earlier because the wave shapes weren't the same. But when you have them both the same shape, you get a more predictable. You get something more characteristic of what you normally hear. I think with a square wave, it's really apparent. Right? Before and after. Let's listen to before and after. Right? That's before. Now after. Isn't that cool? It's just basically the wave is totally it becomes a dynamic entity, right? Because before the wave, I'm playing one note, it's staying stationary. Now I change the detune to something like 0.02. Right? Okay. So what happens afterwards is you have this original simple sound, and then it's getting sent into a filter. We've talked about filters before, but the filters, they appear all over the place. So you can kind of adjust the envelope of the filter as well. You can kind of have it so that the filter does some substantial filtering. And let's see if we can engage that. see. Let's see. I'm trying to think about how this works at the moment. It's been a second since I looked at this parameter really for a moment. Let's see. The goal is, ideally, the filter would actually filter the sound in a manner that over time you would see some of the sound disappear, or this particular shape would be added on top of the sound itself. So seems to be doing something based on looking at the graph, but I'm not hearing what it's doing. Let me turn off detune. Let me just. Huh. How strange. Let's just look through these particular parameters. So this pertains to the attack time. So the attack time becomes shorter at higher velocities, meaning like as I play louder, the attack becomes really short. This is befuddling me, so I might have to get back to you on this particular tool. Oh, is the frequency too high? Let's take a look at that. That's probably what it is. Yes. Thank you, Jarrett. That's exactly what it is. The frequency was too high. So we lower the frequency to a lower threshold, and now check this out. It's basically, it's jumping up to this particular frequency, and then it's filtering up to these particular frequencies, then it's dropping down to filtering nothing. Basically filtering everything. So it's not filtering anything, and then it's filtering everything. So this is sort of a way you can impact loudness of a sound. It's basically similar to an envelope to some degree, because you are affecting loudness of a particular sound, but you can kind of make a sound a little bit more dynamic by adjusting the filter, because you can have independent controls of the filter envelope and the amplitude envelope. So you can, for instance, you can have the filter open up over time, but you can have the volume of the sound occur right away. Let's do something a little more dramatic, like a square wave. So over time, you see how the upper harmonics are appearing over time? If I turn off the filter, what's happening is that all of it appears at the same time. All the harmonics appear at the same time. But if I turn on the filter, right, it kind of gives it a little bit more motion. So it's another way to give your sound motion, which is why a filter frequently appears in the signal chain. But all the other parameters are pretty much the same. Like these parameters right here, the attack, decay, sustain, all of these pertain to the graph itself. You can also, just like with the pitch, you can use the LFO to modulate the cutoff frequency of the filter. So notice how, like, see, the sound itself we're working with is a square wave. But when we filter out all the harmonics, we actually, a filtered square wave actually becomes, in effect, a sine wave. So as we're modulating this, we're modulating between like a square wave and a sine wave. kind of interesting. So you could do stuff like that. This is this is exactly like the classic like dubstep, right? It's just modulating the filter cutoff using an LFO. So you'll see these controls all over the place, and it's we're going to see them in other synthesizers as well. Now let's see. Now let's actually take a closer look at this frequency knob right here. So if we lower the cutoff frequency of this filter, if we lower this knob, it's basically going to affect the entire frequency range. If we set this, it's basically not going to get a chance to affect the entire frequency range except all of the high frequencies. So this is an important knob in order to get what you want, but it's kind of a cool thing to modulate as well. Okay. Now, before I get into amplitude envelope, I mean, I think this is pretty straightforward, right? The amplitude envelope is very similar to a filter envelope, right? It's just basically you're modulating the parameters over time. Now, let's say you find a parameter that you really like, and you want to be able to adjust it on the fly without having to fidget and go through all of these particular menus to access it. So for instance, right here, this filter knob is really cool. Let's say I just want, on the drop of my hat, I want to be able to control that particular parameter. Now listen up, everyone. This is a really cool thing. This right here is, we're going to look into macros. So over here on the drum rack, as well as on instrument racks, and a lot of instruments that you probably see these 8 macro knobs. That's because someone, a sound designer at Ableton or at a third-party location, decided to map these knobs to particular parameters within the synthesizer to make it more easy to play with controls that are the most salient for their creative practice. Okay? So if you want to actually do this, all you have to do is expose the macro controls knob. Then after that, you have to click map. And then after that, you click, in this case, we'll click frequency, and then we'll click map. And then I can turn off map. And now, whoops. Now I've got this convenient interface to basically play around with the controls that I need to play with. So this is actually a really cool way to find cool sounds. Well, to find cool parameters within a sound, and as a result, find cool sounds. Because really, when you play around with these parameters, that's when you really find the different sounds that you're interested in. So what's something else that might be interesting to automate in this regard? Well, there's really no limit to what we can do. But let's say we really like that detuning effect. So let's say I want to map that. Well, I'd go to map, I'd click this, and I'd click map. And now, right, whoops, oh, see, that thing just always wants to play. So I think this is really cool. And also, if you have a particular MIDI keyboard, like the ones that I kind of talked about in, I can't remember when I talked to you about it or where I talked to you about it, but basically one of these MIDI controllers that has these 8 knobs. What's really awesome about these, like basically most controllers nowadays, because of Ableton's popularity, will have 8 knobs. And what's really awesome is that these 8 knobs will usually map perfectly to whatever macro assignments you have right here, which means that you have a very tactile way of playing around with the sound design that you're kind of exploring, which is really cool. So this is really cool. This is something that I want to do more of in my own practice. Just exploring sound design in a very hands-on way by actually making your own instruments, essentially making your own instrument racks. But the nice thing at the end of the day, if this is too overwhelming for you or someone that you know to look at, you can just collapse everything. And now you're left with just these knobs. And just like everything else in Ableton, you can automate it. So for instance, if I want to automate the filter, I think I'm in C minor. So okay, so let's say I want to do something like this. I want to automate this filter frequency. Well, as soon as I click it, the automation, well, I have to engage automation mode by pressing A, but as soon as I click it, it'll appear. So let's say I want to record this. Let's say I already know the MIDI note. I'm gonna select the MIDI note ahead of time. I'm going to create a MIDI note. Oops, my bad. Insert MIDI clip. Right. Did it, right? Let's say I want to bring this down an octave. Okay, cool. So I have this little MIDI clip. And now I want to automate this. Filter 1 frequency cutoff. I can show automation. Okay, this is too quick. So let me actually select all this, duplicate this, duplicate this, duplicate this. Now I've got something like this. I want my automation to kind of appear over time so it doesn't all happen all at once. And I also potentially want to lower the volume of this track in general. Oh, whoops. Is it still doing what I wanted to? Right? So you can do really creative things when you set things up this way, because then they're just available to you and you don't have to fidget with all of these different parameters, which can kind of get overwhelming when you have all of these menus and submenus and groups within groups and all that stuff. Another thing that I do want to mention is when you open this map mode, it actually allows you to choose a range in which you want to map things to. So for instance, let's say you're detuning this and you find that that's too dramatic. You only want, when you turn your knob all the way counterclockwise, you want it to be this value. When you turn your knob all the way clockwise, you want it to be this value. That's the range you want to constrain yourself to. Well, if you click map, then you could basically do negative 0.25 and then positive 0.25. And now, if I turn this knob, it's just constrained to that range. So you can work in a more, you can tweak it to exactly the way you want it to be.
Sorry, Professor, I didn't see where you put the bounds for the range.
Oh yeah, sure. So when you click map, on the top left, you'll see this macro mappings window appear. Actually, just like when you click any kind of mapping in Ableton, if you go to MIDI map, whoops, that's not it. If you go to MIDI map mode or you go to key map mode, you'll see some things appear. What you'll want to do is you'll want to select the minimum range and the maximum range of the particular parameter that you're looking at, depending on the rack that you're interested in.
Thank you.
Absolutely. There's a similar thing up here about key mapping, key map mode, and MIDI map mode. I'll see if I can add the macro map mode too. It's very conceptually similar. It's just you'll notice how on like key map mode there's no need for a minimum or maximum, but for macro map mode there certainly is. And for MIDI map mode there is too, because you could have a MIDI controller and you want to turn a knob a certain direction. You only want it to affect a certain thing. That's one of the more difficult things to talk about in an online class, but you can kind of take my word for it that it's basically very similar. You just select the boundaries. So this is basically, I can't stress how similar this is to so many other paradigms of sound design. You have an oscillator, that's getting filtered. Then you can kind of adjust the volume of the entire thing. There's an LFO where you can kind of control the kind of modulation capabilities. You can kind of change the wave shape of the LFO. So instead of modulating using this kind of shape, you can go to triangle or a rectangle. Right? This is a rectangle, and what's interesting about a rectangle, it's just on off, on off, on off, on off. Right? Because it's on off, on off, on off, on off, right? Whereas a sine is a continuous gradual on, less on, less on, less on, less off, right? Kind of thing. So it's really up to you how you actually play around with these things. You can also do something totally random with noise. Right? Adding to the grittiness factor that you can get using detuning, you can also access parameters like glide and unison. Sorry, I should say vibrato. Let me actually bring up the filter frequency. In fact, let me actually turn off the LFO. Right? That Cars song kind of reminds me of that. There's sort of a wobble. So the vibrato is just basically slightly, it's kind of like a pitch low frequency oscillator, but it works at really, really small thresholds. Like it doesn't do like a great deal of pitch bending. It's like the range it goes, basically. Unison, if you want a little more grit. You can basically detune the different voices that are happening. Because actually, when you're playing a single voice in analog, you're actually playing multiple voices. So I'm playing one note. So it's another way to kind of add some detuning by messing around with this unison mode and the detuning capabilities. You're basically treating each one of these unison voices as a separate voice. You can add even more voices just to make it a thicker sound. This might be a good time to take a break. Hopefully you're kind of following along. I will really recommend a good resource in case you don't know about this. It's an online reference. It's Ableton's online reference to all these devices. It's really helpful. And the online version has the advantage where you don't have to download anything, and you could search for whatever you want. So for instance, I think most of these audio effects or instruments, they're in separate sections. So the instrument reference is here. You open it up, and then you see all of analog's parameters. You know, it's a fair amount of reading, but you can see how complicated it can be. It's not like, you know, I'm trying my best to make things concise, including relevant parameters. But really, there's a lot of stuff that you could gain from this one instrument. You know what I mean? So if you're interested, I'd recommend looking at this. Of course, there are some, you know, the OneNote, or there's good YouTube videos on all this stuff as well. Just to kind of go through the different. I like YouTube videos because you kind of get to the conciseness of a quick presentation instead of having to read a bunch of stuff. But I encourage you to not skimp out on understanding how synthesis works, because it's very easy for you to go that direction because there's so many beautiful presets in Ableton, but there's something really cool about making your own sounds. and sculpting things your own way. I guess before break, I will say this one thing that is a little bit maybe important to know, that you also see in operator. There's a way that you could route all of these particular modules, okay? So currently what's happening is that oscillator 1 is going to filter 1, which is then going to filter 2, which is then going to amplitude, this amplifier section, and it's also going to the amplifier section over here. But you could change the routing, and I think this is what this is talking about, this very beginning section. It's basically talking about all the different paths you can take for signal flow for this particular device. So instead of doing this, you could actually say, I want my oscillator to go equally to filter 1 and filter 2, or I want like 99% of my oscillator to go to filter 1 and 1% of my oscillator to go to filter 2. You can kind of mess around with these different parameters. And as a result, you can have different sounds just by having different filter shapes. So again, we want to adjust the frequency cutoff. Check that out. The filter is quite different, right? And right now, I'm having bad luck with these filters today. I apologize. Oh, I know what's going on. The amplifier's off. Is that what you're going to say?
No. I was going to ask a question, but whenever you're ready.
I figured out why the filter wasn't engaging. This is good. Sometimes it's good to make mistakes and figure out what's going on. So earlier I was trying to figure out why I couldn't get this filter to make sound. Just like I couldn't figure out how to make this filter make sound. The reason I couldn't get this filter to make sound is because this amplifier, after the filter was turned off. But now, you definitely have the effect of the filter. So there's some routing that you can play around with. Yes, was it Adil who asked the question?
Oh, no, it was Jarrett.
Oh, it was Jarrett.
I just had a quick question. When I don't actually know if it makes a difference, but I'm just going to ask anyways. If you have two oscillators going into the same filter, are they filtered separately or are they combined before the filter?
If you have two oscillators going into the filter, are they filtered separately or are they combined before going into the filter? Let's see. I know the answer to wavetable. With the wavetable device, that's something I was just reading up on. But in this case, okay, let's just think about this. Let's think this through. So if I have this oscillator, it's going into, so let's say, okay, the question is basically if I have both of these going to filter 2, are they combined before going into filter 2?
Yeah. Does it really matter even? I guess you'd just be combining the filtered signals or filtered signals afterwards anyways, right?
Yeah, that's what my thinking is. I'm not 100% sure. I'm not sure if the order matters in that situation. Yeah. I mean, I guess they're both getting filtered, so I don't know if it really matters because they're both gonna ultimately get to this point, and I think they're summing up after that.
Okay.
But yeah, but that's a great question because the wavetable device that we're going to talk about actually has some interesting filter modes, which are basically there are more ways that you can route the audio in terms of how the filters are interacting with each other. But anyway, let's take a short break. Maybe we could start again at 12:55. Oh yeah, let's start again at 12:55. And yeah, just keep soaking this stuff up as best as you can. I hope that it's not too confusing. But one of your homework assignments is to actually investigate one of the three synthesizers we're going to talk about today and on Thursday. They're all very powerful synthesizers, and they all yield different results depending on what you're trying to do. You can think about them as the three starting Pokemon when you're making your journey in Kanto or wherever, whichever land you are in. So yeah, they're all very powerful, and they all have they have a lot of similarities. But anyway, we'll reconvene in 10 minutes. Talk soon. Danny back. Danny? No, no, no. Danny, no, Danny. Go back. Okay, so let me actually, so this is the room.
Oh yeah, that's a tall one.
It's the tall one. And yeah, the new lights are there.
Oh, also, tell him. Do you think because the bed's gonna be up there?
We might do that. We're not
So do you think that thing should stay there, or do you think it should move into that corner with that stool? Is that a base?
That's a base.
And look how weird his computer is. Why is that so weird? Because there's a bunch of weird stuff on it. Look at all the bottles and CDs.
I know. I need to clean my room.
And also, hey, you got rid of the thing with peanut butter. Wait, could I show them the cool bed thing?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Oh, press. This is the best one to press. This one.
Okay. How does it fold up like that? Yeah.
It's got an adjustable frame.
And these are all the guitars. Do you use it like that?
Sometimes I'll just sit and read. Like
Do you
yesterday.
use all your guitars?
I do. I use some more than others. Like I use this one the most. I use these three the
Which
most.
one do you use the least?
Well, I probably use the least nowadays. They're probably those two.
Oh, at my house I have that.
You have that one? Oh yeah, it's a cool one. It's a mandolin.
But I also have this one.
Oh yeah, this is fun. I love this.
That's how far it can go.
My
And that's,
brother has that one. Well, so do I, but it's Mandarin.
Oh really? Yeah.
yeah, well, Nakul, you should get rid of this. Like, this bathroom is so dirty.
I know. We just cleaned everything out of it though. No, we're in the process of cleaning. Wait till you see it next time,
This
guys.
is the closet. Hey, you put this my birthday present on the floor.
Gee, I got her that thing. We still haven't used it.
Well,
So
we're
it's
going
such.
to. Why do you have this in your room?
Oh, we're doing some construction in here, so.
And also these huge speakers. Can you turn on the lights?
I'll see if I can. Let me see.
What's that?
Oh, these are studio lights.
No, the things that are popping out of the walls.
Oh, those are audio diffusers. They kind of just deflect the sound so that it's not. It just makes the room sound a little more lively.
And also, the lights could change.
The lights can change color, and
Your video's still on, just saying that.
it is still on. That's true, but I have a virtual background, so
Oh, so nobody sees it.
everyone's seeing me, but I guess maybe everyone can see you every now and then, but.
Why don't you want anybody to see your guitar?
Hey, they could see me.
Yeah. One sec. Actually, let me. One sec. Be right back.
Hey, I've never been back here.
One sec.
Not even as tall as the bed.
Wait, are you on mute? Are you on mute?
Recording. Okay. I should be recording again. Okay. There's a really good website. This might be a good time to talk about this. Max for Live. Max for Live is a really amazing website where you could download a bunch of Ableton devices that are programmed in Max, MSP, which is a very powerful programming language that interacts with Ableton really, really well. So for instance, I don't know if I have any specific recommendations, but for instance, if you want, like if you go on Max for Live and you look up, let's see, if I just look up a synthesizer, for instance. I mean, it's not necessary that you go, oh yeah, trying to find something that's just purely a synthesizer. Best Max for Live synthesizers. 4 free Max for Live synths to spark your creativity. So, okay, ck.acid.
I thought Max for Live was also only for the suite.
I think if you want to do edits on it, let's see, using Max for Live, Ableton Standard. Maybe you're right. Maybe. Oh, let's see. Okay. Oh, okay. This available as a separate instrument type thing. Let's take a look. Huh. Does anyone know how to read German? Let's see.
On the comparison of them on the website, Max for Live is only for the suite.
I see. Okay, so best VST synth. Okay. Okay. So this is a great resource to look at. Best VST. Wait. Sorry. Best free VST synths. Oops. Sorry. Huh. Okay. Yeah, so some of these look pretty intense. Dex is a freeware FM synthesis based on the legendary Yamaha DX7. I've heard really good things about this one, actually. In fact, there's a little bit, I mean, actually, these should be pretty straightforward to install, actually, if you just download them. And you will be able to expose certain controls. This one right here, I've heard really good things about this one, but this is FM synthesis. This looks more like, maybe this looks more like the analog that we're using right now in terms of parameters. You know, if we zoom in, I guess you can kind of see these different oscillators. You could see triangle, sine wave, pulse width, things like that. You could change the tuning of these particular oscillators. So in some ways, I think you'd have a lot of luck using a synthesizer like this, because you can also access LFOs for these oscillators. Oh, okay, then we have some suggestions in the chat. Free VSTs are a rabbit hole. Delay Llama is the best VST. That is a joke. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, there are so many of these things that are free. ADSR, you see this classic envelope. You see a filter section. LFO, oscillators. You see very similar concepts to what we've been talking about. So then I guess the thing to become familiar with is the routing of the particular synthesizer. Like how does the oscillator, for instance, interact with the filter and the amplitude envelope? And that's something that you kind of have to figure out by reading the manual or the documentation. But one good guess would be the oscillator goes through the filter, and then it goes to the envelope, and then it goes to the master. Same with this. But you know, it takes a little bit of familiar. Oh, this is also a really powerful one, but I would maybe avoid this one because it doesn't coexist with Ableton's ecosystem as friendly as it could. But yeah, and I don't know what comes with Ableton by default on the standard edition. I can't remember. Meaning, like, of these instruments, you probably, that's too bad that it doesn't come with operator. It doesn't come with any of the starting Pokemon. It does come with.
We only get 5 of the software instruments, where the suite gets 15.
Which ones do you get?
I know we have, let me check really quickly. We only get drum rack, external instrument, impulse, instrument rack, and simpler.
Okay, yeah, unfortunately, there's not a ton you can do. I mean, simpler is the closest kind of thing you can do to what I'm talking about. If you dragged a sine wave into simpler, you would get a sound that you could modulate and do things like that with. Yeah, so I would experiment with some third-party VSTs just to get a better handle on this stuff, because it's definitely worth it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. So anyway, let's dive into another modality. We've talked about analog just to kind of wrap up analog. You have an oscillator that could either go to filter 1 or filter 2. Once it goes to these particular filters, it then gets processed by an amplitude envelope, which basically determines the shape of the volume over time of the particular sound. And then it gets sent to the master output, right? And then there are some parameters here where you can kind of adjust. You can adjust certain things to do with your keyboard and certain parameters that have to do with how your keyboard interacts with the actual instrument as well. There's also there's some quick routing options here where you're like, okay, I want oscillator 1 to go to filter 1, and I want it to go to amplitude 1. And then I want oscillator 2 to go to filter 2, and then to amplifier 2. That's like a quick routing thing, and notice how these numbers change depending on which routing you select. But this is sort of a nice, convenient way in case you're a little confused by this. You can just click these quick routing things, and then you can experiment with these different paths, signal paths. Okay. Great. Okay, so that's a little bit of analog. Okay, great. So now, remember, we were talking about the instrument rack to begin with. And we started discussing these other instruments in the context of how we could create a multi-timbral sound with many layers. Now, the idea is I can drag another instrument or another device onto this particular chain selector view, and I'll be able to hear two sounds, sound engines operating at the same time. So this time I will drag on operator. Okay, here is operator. Now operator actually has 4 different oscillators that you can mess around with. And there's a lot of interesting stuff you can do with this particular synthesizer. So to start, if you go to the global section, which is in the bottom right, you kind of see this routing situation. And essentially, what you want to do with this routing thing is you can do certain things like you did in analog, where you can route the way the oscillators interact with each other. But there's more complicated routings you can do, because this isn't only an additive synthesis. It's an additive synthesizer. This is also an FM synthesis engine. So right here, if I have it like this is just purely additive synthesis, meaning I have this oscillator, and then I have this oscillator, I have this oscillator, I have this oscillator. I'm summing up the results of all of these different sounds that each one of these is producing separately, and then all of a sudden, I have one super timbre of sorts. But if I open it up in the mode that it opens by default, this is actually FM, frequency modulation synthesis. And essentially what frequency modulation synthesis in a nutshell is that it allows you to modulate the frequency of an oscillator over time. Essentially, you're modulating the phase. You're basically using a sine wave to modulate the frequency of an oscillator. So it's like a sine inside a sine, basically. So in other words, this oscillator is affecting this oscillator in a way that might not be immediately apparent what's happening. So for instance, let's just start with the first oscillator. And I'm playing a sound with the first oscillator. I'm going to mute, by the way, I'm an instrument rack. I'm going to mute this other instrument, analog, because we're done talking about analog. We'll go on to operator, and I soloed it by accident, so let me actually mute it by turning it off. Right? And I get a sine wave, because the actual oscillator itself is a sine wave. I'm looking at these controls, and I just know that this is where the sine wave lives, and it's a sine wave, right? I could change this to be a square wave. Or more rich square wave. Right? And what's interesting about this is that it's actually showing you basically a spectrogram in some ways. It's showing you how you can build the sound using harmonics. And so it's showing you like you could, so for instance, let me show you what I mean. I'm going to take an equalizer, and what's going to happen once I drag this equalizer onto this effect is that you're going to look at the sound, and this particular graph is going to look very similar to this graph. It looks pretty similar. Like let's look at it. You see how it's kind of like the shape kind of looks like that on this particular graph. That's to say, if you have this particular shape in the frequency domain, like this is a frequency graph of the sound, it'll look like this in the time domain picture of the graph. So this is an oscilloscope, and this is a spectrogram. And so in this particular graph, I'm looking at the time domain. Oh, I just zoomed in. I didn't know I could do that. I'm looking at the time domain picture. Like I'm basically looking at snapshots over time of how this wave looks. And here I'm looking at how the sound looks in terms of what frequencies are inside the sound. So I see there's a lot of 100 hertz. I see there's a lot of 1,000 hertz. I see as I get higher in frequency, the amplitudes of those frequencies actually decrease over time. So this is actually, this particular frequency graph is a recipe for a square wave. This is how you make a square wave, essentially. If you include these ingredients in the frequency domain, in the time domain, you'll get a square wave. So this is an interesting kind of graph in that regard. What's cool about this is you can actually draw any shape you want. And you won't always get predictable results. Like I didn't know that this was the shape, the time domain shape of this. This is what the sound looks like in the frequency domain, and this is what the sound looks like in the time domain. And what's really important to know is that if I only have one harmonic, this will look like a sine wave. So in the frequency domain, I only have one peak. And in the time domain, it looks like a sine wave. If I add more peaks over time, and I make the peaks decrease like this, it'll look kind of square-like. I didn't do as good a job. There's a certain ratio of how the fall, but there's a certain recipe, essentially, for how to create these waves. So you can kind of visualize the recipes as well. But let's say you don't want to do that. You just want to pick a preset wave. That's totally fine. They have all the waves you're probably familiar with by now. They have the triangle wave, and this is what a triangle wave looks like in the frequency domain. Sine wave looks like that. We talked about that. Sine wave 4-bit. You know, they all look relatively the same. So let's say we want to work with a sine wave. Great. So we have a sine wave. Now the second oscillator is actually playing right now, but it's off. Notice how, as I make that second oscillator louder, it kind of changes the sound in kind of dramatic way. It's not like it's just adding a sound to the original sound. It's like it's modulating the sound, right? And if I change this value, it's basically making the sound richer by adding more harmonics to the sound. You know, if I look at this particular graph, let me actually put this over here so you can see it a little better. Right? So the way this has changed right now, the way this device is working is that this first oscillator is feeding into the second oscillator. And what's going on right here is actually FM synthesis. And so you get this kind of sound that is different than what you get with analog. And you could really emphasize the FM synthesis component by changing this to fixed. And right now, it's actually, FM synthesis is a very unwieldy process. It's very difficult to find parameters that work nicely. So what Ableton's trying to do for us is to try to make it easy for us. It's trying to say, well, let's make it easy for the user. And what's happening is they're basically selecting harmonics that you're building on top of the original sound. So it's basically saying, I want the fundamental, I want the first harmonic, the second harmonic, third harmonic, fifth. You basically hear the harmonic series, right? You can detune it just to get these really gritty kind of sounds, FM kind of sounds, right? But another thing you can do just to really get those FM sounds is by turning on fixed. And you can play around with it. And you get some really interesting timbres that actually don't always, if you have fixed mode on, the timbres aren't always predictable in terms of depending on what pitch you're playing. So if I'm playing a different pitch, the timbre actually changes. If I turn off fixed, I mean, the timbre stays consistent. But essentially what's happening under the hood when I have this routing in this current configuration is I have some FM synthesis going on. So, you know, in the most nice case that Ableton has it for us, you know, you can just experiment with adding some upper harmonics and just playing around with the levels of these particular sounds. Just to make a richer sound, right? This is just all in the sculpting the actual oscillator itself, right? But if you want to actually mess around with the actual sound in terms of the filter and all that stuff, right? Right, you can mess around with the filter, how the filter is acting, how it's behaving. You could also, just like with analog, there's also a pitch envelope. So you can actually mess around with the pitch envelope of the sound as well. Right? You have to control the amount that's actually being sent in. And of course, just like there's a pitch envelope, there's also a way to use an LFO, right? There's all these classic controls. So someone asked, operator just seems like a different way to achieve the same thing. Is there anything other than coarse fine that makes it more useful than analog in certain areas? Well, I guess FM tones just sound different. It's like, you know, a lot of bell tones are constructed using FM. You get more non-harmonic tones by it. By using analog, you can get a wide gamut of different inharmonic tones. It's the only way I can put it. It's just you're going to get dirtier sounds if you kind of play around with it in this particular configuration. So some people really like the sound of FM. Some people don't like the sound of FM as much, but it gives you the capability of doing that. But a lot of the other parameters are indeed the same. So there's a ton of stuff that you can do with all these different instruments. But another thing that's kind of useful to do if you are using this particular instrument, let me actually change the filter cutoff. Turn off the LFO. Maybe the pitch envelope is a little too dramatic. Right? One thing that you could do is you could set, right now my velocity isn't mapped to anything. So you kind of have to manually map all this stuff. Like right now I can't play louder and I can't play softer. So I actually have to go in to the global settings right here, and I have to click velocity is mapped to volume with a certain amount. Now it's mapped in such a way where I actually can feel the volume affect the velocity itself. So this is operator. So you might run into it. So let's just pull up a preset patch that uses operator, and let's take a look at some preset sound design. And so, for instance, I'm going to delete this chain. Go to operator. Let's take a look at a bass sound. Okay. Expose. We don't need to see any of that except the device, right? So let's take a look at exactly what this particular synthesis designer has done. So they set coarse to be 0.5 instead of 1. So that's actually going to bring it down an octave. The fundamental pitch is going to be down an octave. So if I set this to 1, it's appropriate for a bass sound, right? I also have to solo the other thing that I have. Right? This particular preset's called absolute filth, which kind of makes sense. You can get these kind of dirty sounds with this particular modality. So right here, I'm going to turn off each oscillator one at a time. So cat is bothering me again. So here, I'm going to turn off oscillator 2. And notice, let's just take a look at the routing really quickly. The routing is sequential. So I think if I turn off oscillator A, nothing will happen. Because it's depending on, because the sound in oscillator A is being fed into oscillator B. So if I turn off oscillator A, there's nothing to feed into oscillator B, and it doesn't work. So let me turn off oscillator B. In other words, you can't even hear it by itself. You can only hear the addition of it on top of it. So if we're just looking at oscillator A, there's some other stuff going on. There's all kinds of devices here. This is how an instrument rack can get quite complicated. There's an auto filter, which is causing the wah, wah, wah effect. So now we're actually hearing the true sound of this particular contribution that this particular oscillator is playing. So basically what this is doing is it's taking this sound, which is a very simple sound, and it's just adding it onto this. It's just adding this higher buzzy, higher frequency sound to the original sound. And there seems to be some beating in terms of how they're actually interacting with one another. So what's a little confusing about working with some of these devices is that they're mapped. Like once you map something to a macro knob, you can't actually use the knob unless you're using the actual macro knob itself. So if you're trying to learn about what someone's doing, it's sometimes useful to just right-click this and to like just unmap, for instance, just to see what that parameter was doing. So this is an envelope rate sort of thing. This is just controlling the envelope rates, the length of the sound itself, basically. The filter doesn't seem to be doing anything at all. So it's interesting to kind of just figure out different settings just by looking at different patches, but it can be a little confusing to kind of have to look through all of the different components of a signal chain. So I think it's helpful to kind of turn on and turn off what isn't what you're not immediately trying to learn about, so that you can kind of get a better sense for what contribution that sound is actually making to the sound itself. So all these other processings, all these sounds are adding an incredible amount of processing to the sound. But I will say that in general, FM synthesis is kind of unpredictable. So if you're using FM synthesis, you're going to have, you know, you might run into sounds that you might never have come across otherwise. So it's a very cool mode of synthesis. At least Operator facilitates it. All the parameters are basically very, very similar to what you'd expect in another synthesizer. And yeah, it's a lot of the same sort of thing, right? You saw this exact knob in the other device, right? You have to set the filter cutoff so that this envelope can even begin to work, right? So this is a cool device, but actually my favorite device as of late is this device called Wavetable, which I can show you guys about. So Wavetable is a really powerful wavetable synthesis engine, okay? Wavetable, if you've ever used Massive or you've used, I think Sierra might work in a similar way actually. I think it's also a wavetable synthesis engine. It allows you to get an incredibly rich collection of sounds at your fingertips that you can modulate very easily using this sort of matrix mode. So this is a new device that's used in Ableton 10. I think it's straightforward. I like it because it's more straightforward. I like analog because it's more straightforward. Operator I find to be a little more unpredictable. But Wavetable, essentially what a wavetable is it is a collection of waveforms that's in a table. So what I'm pointing at here is all these different lines or these different curves are parallel to one another. They're all different waves that you're basically cycling through. So it's like a wavetable is actually a big collection of different oscillators that you can play through, which is really cool. So what you see over here is you have the basic shapes that that you're familiar with. So and you can morph between basic shapes. So right here I have a sine wave. I can morph to kind of this shape, to this triangular wave, all the way to this square wave. And you can morph, and it's kind of fun to modulate through these different shapes. And what's really handy about this particular interface is that it makes it really easy to modulate different parameters. So what I mean, ooh, sorry, my cat is. Stop. Okay, sorry, cat. All right. It makes it really easy to modulate these parameters. So let's say you like the sound of this going up and down. Well, what's a standard way that you would use to modulate a sound like that in a periodic way? What is the kind of tool that you would use to make that kind of modulation?
LFO.
Automation.
You could use automation, or you could use an LFO. Let's use an LFO for now, because it's actually built in. The workflow to use an LFO is really convenient with this. So if I open up the matrix view, what I can do is I can basically, as soon as I click any parameter in this device, notice how it appears right here. So if I click this parameter, it appears right there as well. So this is really neat because all of a sudden now I can use this to modulate something, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to modulate this position using LFO1. It's just that easy. You go to the matrix mode, and all of a sudden, you can now modulate this parameter very simply. You can modulate this wavetable position by using an LFO. And right now you can't see the LFO because it's in the mod sources menu, but if this is getting a little cluttered for you, you could actually just click, you can expose all of the different modulators, the envelopes and the LFOs, and you can kind of control them however you'd like. So for instance, right now, this oscillator 1 position is being modulated by LFO1. I'm actually going to change this basic shapes wavetable to something a little more interesting. I'm going to set this to a higher value because right now, so right now it's basically operating. You could have it operate differently, continuously like that, right? Just by changing the behavior of the LFO. You could change the rate, of course. Right? You could change the amount that the LFO is actually acting on, the shorter range. And what's crazy about this is you can actually modulate the LFO with another LFO. So for instance, now look at this LFO1 amount. I can actually modulate the LFO1 amount or the LFO1 rate by with LFO2. It's meta. It's meta right here, right? Because you can do amazing things by these modulation. I find this to be a really creative, powerful workflow. It's very intuitive to me because you kind of know exactly what you're going to get. But it's as simple as this. You pick a parameter you want to modulate. You look at the modulation matrix, and on the columns, you basically see what parameter you've clicked. And then on, sorry, I said it backwards. On the rows, you see what parameter you've clicked. And on the columns, you see what parameters you want to map that to. So that's what this modulation matrix means. So for instance, if I wanted to just modulate the pitch, this is going to sound really strange, but I could do a little warble. Right? You can do things like that. And what's also powerful about this, just like analog, is that there's actually not just one oscillator, there's two oscillators. So you can actually turn on the second oscillator by clicking this button right here. You can have a different shape for this oscillator altogether. And you can have these rich sounds. What I did here, instead of detuning the second oscillator, which I could do also, is I actually lowered the oscillator by 24 semitones because like many of these synthesis engines, you have agency in controlling the starting pitch of what you're trying to create. So if you want to create a really like kind of rich sound, it's nice to add some grit by changing the pitch of one of these oscillators from the other oscillator. And then you can actually modulate this wavetable too. You can modulate the position of this wavetable using LFO2 if you want, or you can actually modulate it using LFO1. So right here, oscillator 2 position. So that's interesting already. You don't have to use LFOs. You can use envelopes because you have all these envelopes available to you. You could, for instance, let's see how that would sound. Let's actually return to default, right-click and return to default. And instead of doing that, I think you can also just click it and delete it, and that'll delete it as well. Let's take a look at this particular parameter, which is oscillator 2 position, and let's see if we map it to envelope 1, or sorry, envelope 2. So what this means is that this particular oscillator is jumping from this point in the wavetable down to this point in the wavetable. Right? If I raise this value, it's basically jumping from this point in the wavetable up to a lower, like a higher point in the wavetable. And in this configuration, I'm actually starting from a low point, I'm jumping to a higher point. Right? Excuse me. Okay. Another thing to keep in mind about, oh, pardon me. I'm all coughed up. Another thing to keep in mind about this particular oscillator is not just the way that these interact with the modulators, but also how they interact with the filters. So earlier we were talking, was talking with Jarrett about different filter modes or how filters interact with analog. For a wavetable, you can have different modes for how they kind of work. So you have two oscillators, remember, and you could have it so that basically oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 are routed into filter 1, and then they get sent into filter 2. So remember, there's two filters here, which you have to turn on. So you could basically set it to start, go into filter 1, and then basically go into filter 2 afterwards. Or wait a second, I think something is missing. Maybe not. You could also have it so that basically they're both routed into filter 1, and they're also both routed into filter 2. And that's what this parallel mode is. They're both routed into filter 1 first, or at the same time as when they're both routed into filter 2. And then the split mode is when oscillator 1 is only routed into filter 1, and oscillator 2 is only routed into filter 2. So you basically have agency in separating the signal and filtering it however you like. So for instance, if oscillator 1, you want to have a kind of a more of a low cut, sorry, high cut. In oscillator 2, you want like all the brightness of oscillator 2. And you might discover, oh, I want to modulate that. And then it's just as easy to modulate this by messing around with the LFO matrix. Or you might even want to modulate this one as well, right? So that's basically how the filters interact with the oscillators. Another thing to kind of keep in mind is the sub bass. So if you do have a bass sound, it's kind of nice sometimes to turn in a little bit of add a little bit of a sound down there just to kind of fatten up the bass sound a little bit. I know I'm kind of going through this kind of fast. Sorry about that. But there are other parameters as well. We've talked about unison. You could kind of broaden the sound by making it a little bit. You could basically separate the voices in different ways by messing around with these different unison modes. Sounds much fuller, right? Because you have 8 voices and you kind of separate them that way. So there's all kinds of information in the reference manual, and I'll put it on OneNote as well. Very rich, very cool sounding stuff. Extremely powerful. Wavetable is a great instrument. But just to kind of remind you how this all ties into instrument racks, we now have 2 different instruments. We've got this sound right here, and we've got our original analog sound over here. I got rid of the FM sound because I wasn't feeling it. If we combine them, just the spur of the moment, this is what we came up with, and we have both of these sounds layered as one within one instrument rack. And this is convenient because I know some people might work in a way where they actually they'll have the same MIDI on repeat throughout the track, and they'll have, you might do something like this where you're like, oh, I want my, let's see, I've got too many windows open. Let me rename this the instrument rack, right? So you might have something like this, where you have some MIDI, and you have this, right? And then you might, without knowing about this technique, you might do something like this, where you duplicate this MIDI track, right? And then you have like your analog on one of the tracks, then you have your wavetable on the other track. But that's sort of like not the most efficient workflow, because why have 2 separate MIDI clips when you can use the same MIDI clip for a more layered sound, right? So that's the big advantage of an instrument rack. You can put many different instrument chains on the same exact rack, and as a result, you save on processing power, and you kind of, well, it's arguable whether you save on processing power, but you save on convenience by having to reference the same MIDI clip. So if you change one of the notes on one MIDI clip, you're essentially ensuring, you don't necessarily ensure that you've changed the notes on the other MIDI clip, but here you do. It's like you only have one MIDI clip to work with. It simplifies your workflow. And instrument racks, the other great thing about them is that you have all these macro knobs. And actually, what's interesting about these macro knobs is you can actually map more than one thing to a specific knob. So for instance, let's take a look at that feature. So right now I've got tone at 97%, but I could also map tone to that particular macro 1. And now you see how macro 1 is mapped to both tone and the other thing we mapped it to, which was the F1 frequency, right? Let me actually undo that. Let me make it something a little more dramatic, because I remember tone didn't do something as dramatic as I would like it to. Let's play the sound. Okay, let's map the frequency to macro 1. Okay, so we'll take the frequency and we'll map it to macro 1. Right? So you can kind of imagine all these performative possibilities. Like you might want to turn one knob. It's basically one knob to rule them all, right? You can, if you decide, if you're feeling like I want one knob to basically affect all these things in all these different ways, then this is the solution to that. A useful case for this is something like the the saturator that we were working on the other day. If you remember the saturator, it was a parameter that was a little tricky because as you raised one knob, you'd have to lower the other knob, right? So let me actually pull up a saturator here. And let me pull it up, and I can also put it on the instrument rack because it belongs to this entire device. I'll just put it at the very end, right? I'll put it right here. And that should, whoops, that's not what I want to do. Let me collapse this. And let me, is it true that you actually have to put it on, maybe you can't actually put it on all the devices at the same time. Maybe you have to put it on one device at a time. So let's say I do have that. Let's say I just put a saturator. Oh, I have a saturator chain now. That's interesting. How does that work? No, that's not what we want. Let's say I just put the saturator on the wavetable, right? Notice how as I increase the drive, the saturation increases, right? But the result of this, if you remember from last time, is that the signal actually gets louder. So if I had the output really high in this particular case, it's 0, and I increase the drive, I actually get more saturation, but it gets louder, right? So what if I wanted to do something where as I turn this knob up, this knob actually went down? So I could actually more clearly hear the saturation in a more regulated way. Well, I could do that. The way I would do that is by using the macro knob again. I would click this drive and I would map it to macro 3, and I'd click this output and I'd map it to click this output, and a second. Map it to output 3, macro 3, right? And now what I'd have to go into the macro map settings and I have to basically invert one of them from the other. So the minimum for the drive is -36 to 36, and the output is -36 to 0. So I have to just flip this. So I have to do 36 or 0 to -36. And now as I turn this knob clockwise, that'll actually, it's hard to see, but basically that'll cause the knob to turn in a different way. So let's say I do this. Notice how I turn the knob all the way clockwise, all the way over here, and notice how this knob went all the way counterclockwise, right? But this knob still went clockwise, which is what we want, because as we increase the drive, we want to lower the output. So for instance, let me see, let me actually loop this. And we have to mess around with the range a little bit, right? The range isn't exactly what we want, but you can hear more saturation as we increase the knob. So it's useful, I guess, to use these macros and to mess around with their placement like this to kind of get more complicated controls out of your synthesis and your sound environment. It's a little bit tricky, but you'll get used to it for sure. I think I might make the final assignment for the final polished track. I think I might have you make one of these so that you can get a handle on how to do this. And then you can kind of have, what the advantage of making something like this would be is that you can have some live performance capabilities thrown into your track. So if there's certain effects that you really like, but you don't necessarily want them to be on all the time, and you just want one convenient interface to kind of operate on all of your sounds at any given time, you might just put something like this on your master track using an effect rack, which we will talk about on Thursday. We've talked about an instrument rack, but you can actually do the same thing with audio effects using an audio effect rack. So essentially, there are 3 different types of racks. And as we come across them, we'll kind of see them. There's the audio effect rack. There is the instrument rack. Where is it? The instrument rack, right? You just see them in their respective categories. So you see the instrument rack and you see the drum rack. So for all three of these, there's a rack version for all 3 of these. There's the audio effect rack, there's the instrument rack, and then there's the drum rack. How is that for you guys? I hope I didn't overwhelm you guys with all that information. But
It's not too bad.
it's not too bad? Okay, cool. Class was a little more silent today. Hope it all made sense.
I'm tired. I just got done flying for 6 hours.
Oh man, hope you rest up.
Yeah, I'm
Feel
about
it,
to
man.
take a nap after this.
Yeah, I think I might do the same. But anyway, of course, if you have any questions, let me know. We could figure it out, and I'll keep adding to the OneNote, especially with this rack stuff and the sidechain compression. And if you think of anything else that you'd like clarification on, just let me know, and we can figure out a time to talk about it or to meet, and however, and just get started on your next to last penultimate homework assignment. And I guess the next 2 classes are going to be the last 2 classes. We're going to listen to student tracks for the second half of class on Thursday, but we're going to talk more about some of this stuff. But eventually, I think on Tuesday of next week, we're going to finally talk about the session view, because we haven't talked about the live capabilities, but that should be a nice kind of way to wrap this up, because we've talked about effect racks and we will have talked about all that stuff. So putting this all in the live context is, I think, a good thing. So, all right, guys. I guess that's it for today. But let me know if you have any questions about any of this stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Take care.
Yeah, take care.
Nicole, I have a quick question.
Yeah, sure.
I'm still like looking for other like free synthesizers of the same range. I found one called Surge, which is a free open source hybrid synthesizer. But yeah, I'm just trying to find one that, or a couple that might be similar to the ones in Ableton. Specifically, I'm kind of looking for also like a wavetable one because I'm interested in that one.
Oh yeah, I hear you. It's such a cool one. Free wavetable synth. Let's see. It looks like let's see. I'm gonna look up best free wavetable synth.
I've been looking at this one called Surge because it has 8 like oscillator systems. So it says it has classic sine, wavetable, FM2, FM3, but I don't.
Oh, I see. Okay, so Surge synth. Is that okay? Let me just go on their website. Surge synth. Okay. It looks like okay, to wrap my head around this. There's FM synthesis capabilities here. Seems like a pretty powerful synthesizer. Let's see, why don't I just download this synth really quickly? Download 64-bit AU. 63. Allow. How did you find out about this one?
Through the multiple websites. Well, the website actually that you first went to actually mentioned it if you kept going down.
I see. So it seems like it has a pretty good track record. Let's see. Continue. Search. Also a really good tasty soda. Have you downloaded it already?
No, I haven't.
Let me see if it's worth. I'm sure it's like definitely worth its salt. Let's see. To rescan plugins. If you do install it, you have to. There's a couple things you could do. You might have to restart. You don't have to restart Ableton, but you have to rescan your plugins folder, and you have to make sure that your VST plugins are recognizable by Ableton. Let's see. Okay. Okay, that means Surge should appear. Let me see if it does. Surge. Surge synth. Okay, Surge. All right. Maybe there's just a preset. Patch wavetable. Sine. Oh. This is pretty intense. I don't know how much I'll be able to figure out on the fly. I have to think about this. It's, let's see. There's an oscillator here. Okay, that's the pitch control. Okay, so this is the wavetable component. Okay. Okay, so this is cool. The one thing that's really cool about the Ableton one is I'm not sure if it does the, that's cool. I wonder how you can route this to an LFO, because I think that's the really cool thing. Like you want to modulate these parameters, and because like you probably want to do stuff like that, perhaps. And I'm wondering where to access that parameter. I think, well, if you go to LF, oh, weird. Okay. What does this do? Oh. Huh. Oh, well, let's look up a patch that actually has that kind of sound. So this is using an LFO. Pretty confident it's doing that. Oh, okay. Oh, whoops. Oh, interesting. What I did notice that was kind of interesting is when I right-clicked this, it's saying it's somehow modulated to pitch. It's mapping to pitch. Edit envelope 2. Great. So it is doing that. It's just how did it connect that? That's like the big mystery. Oh, maybe it's this. Okay, I have to look at the documentation. Mapping LFO. How to apply modulation to parameters. There we go. Select the modulation source you'd like to use. Engage routing mode with a second click on the source. Oh, okay, that's how you do it. So LFO3, if we want to modulate sub-os width, now it's modulated to. Okay, you know what? Let's just start with a brand new patch. Create a new patch. Okay, surge. Okay. All right, so. Okay, so let's say we want to modulate this pitch using LFO1. I believe you click it, it turns bright green, you click pitch. And now it's mapped. But I think what you got to do is you got to. It is mapped, but we have to edit value. 12, maybe? I don't know. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Oh, is that how you do it? Oh, I think that's how you do it. So what it basically, okay, I think I figured it out. So this stuff right here is the modulation. These are the things you can modulate, and I don't know what an SLFO is, but that's something to read about. And then what you basically do is you select the thing you want to modulate. You select the, like an LFO can modulate things, right? So you select the LFO, and then after that you basically click the parameter you want to change, and then you drag left and right to change the range for how much it wants to change. And so for instance, I think oh, you know what's interesting? Oh, this is all mapping to LFO1, so I didn't realize that. So you have to click LFO1 afterwards, because right now this is, if you don't want it to map, you have to double click. Like right now this is all mapping. Mm-hmm. So if you click this, it'll basically appear, and then you'll see a second knob, and so. That sort of thing. You know, that is the most basic description I can tell you about modulation. But it's really powerful. It can do all this stuff. It doesn't have like the nice graphical window of how it looks, but you can just download a free plugin to do that. And like the oscilloscope, or the oscilloscope that I showed you is free. The M oscilloscope. But so I think all these other filter capabilities are still available to you. So how does this route though? Is this gonna go directly to this before it? That's probably worth looking up too. Let's see, routing, modulation routing. How to apply modulation across mod source routing. Surge hierarchy, modulation routing and depth modulation. patch global, maybe. This is a beast. Filter controls. On this. Okay. Okay, so this stuff is all hardwired, and it seems like everything that's going through the system by default is going through this filter and then going through this amplitude envelope. Because as I change this amplitude envelope, notice how it takes a long time for the sound to set in. Sorry, as I change the attack of the amplitude envelope. Similarly, if I change the attack of the filter, it should be the same kind of behavior, except it's not because maybe the cutoff isn't set correctly. Let's see. Okay, I think we get this modulation routing section, except maybe we need to. This thing certainly is powerful. I don't know how easy it is to use at first, but it's powerful, all right.
Yeah, I mean, if this one doesn't, if you don't think it's like friendly enough for a beginner like myself, I can look into another one. I'm just having a hard time finding ones.
Yeah, I think this one's good, but I think for the wavetable stuff, this is great. If you want something more like analog, then no, it's not that, all of it isn't bad once you get the hang of it. But oh, I see. Okay, filter 1 cutoff is here. Filter, okay. Been having bad luck with filters today. Let's see. Okay, there we go. It's these little tiny, this interface is just small. It's just, these are the filter modes. So right here, there's no filtering. But right here, it's actually doing a low pass filter. It's a steeper low pass filter. So if you wanted to, you could map this to this. Things like that. And I feel like there's got to be a way to do this with beats, like the. Oh wow! It also lets you like mouse over and change stuff. Are you following along with what I'm showing? Is it tractable, you think?
Yeah, I'm following. It's easier with the Ableton tools, but I'm following.
It's on tape for posterity too, so I think it'll be on the end. So let's see. Yeah, it is a little easier with the Ableton tools, but it's not so, like, the LFO is not so bad. It's that is pretty cool. I'm trying to think of the thing that's nice about the LFO in Ableton is that it syncs to the BPM, and I wonder if there's a way to sync up BPM. Sync surge to BPM. Surge, what do they call it? Sync surge synth? Once tempo synced. Oh, tempo sync, all right. Some parameters can be, the option tempo sync will appear in the context menu if they do. Okay. We'll show a TS symbol. Oh, tempo sync. So you right click it. That's cool. So it technically, I think, is with the metronome. Oh yeah, so it's actually changing triplets. This thing is great, man. This is actually a great. I would totally encourage you to learn how to use this, but it's basically it's just a powerful behemoth of a tool, but it's so powerful. My goodness. And it's free. That's amazing. Miller Puckett would love this. Let's see. So this is this is all the LFO section. So I guess contextually speaking, as you go to the LFO, you can access these. But I'm wondering how you access a simple envelope. So you have an LFO, but by the way, Jared, what's up, man? Are you around?
Yeah, I'm here. I was just gonna ask you something after all this, but I'm kind of enjoying this. This synth looks awesome.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Yeah, this is really cool. I'm definitely gonna keep this on my machine.
I think I saw the envelope right there under like EG on the synth.
Oh, okay.
If you go back to Ableton.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I think it's those on the right there. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. This, are you talking about this section right here?
Yeah, that's what I was looking at. If that's what you're trying to do.
Yeah. Well, what I was hoping to be able to do is map, like you know, you can click this and you can map certain parameters to LFOs. I was hoping there's a way to map certain parameters to an envelope. But I don't know if that is possible. It's like there's a section on modulation, how to apply modulation to parameters, and I think I just don't know what some of these things are. Like LFO is, this has got to be some type of LFO. Poly aftertouch, channel pitch bend, mod wheel, cutoff, skew, low, mid, high.
On yours, there was one that said amp EG on that spot that you can click. So maybe if you click that, you can map it to the.
Oh, there we go. There you go. Exactly. Okay. Awesome, man. So now if we click this, now I guess we could modulate. What's a good parameter to modulate? Maybe. Now I don't remember what we've modulated. Maybe like.
There's so many.
There's so many. Maybe the pitch. Okay, so it's going to that pitch really quickly, but if we actually change the amp AG, that's what we selected, right? So. Interesting. All right. So you can do, yeah. I mean, it's yeah. It's all there. It's all there. But there's only, unfortunately, there's one less envelope that's available to you than in Ableton, because you'd have to reuse one of these envelopes if, let's say, you wanted to. But you know, you could use it's a little too. I guess it's not so bad. It's because both of these are associated with filter. This is associated with filter. This is associated with amplitude. So you have to reuse one of the pre-existing envelopes. But it seems like that is the basic gist of this. Then there's all this complex routing, which I don't pretend to know what it means. It's, I guess, like, yeah, but depending on how it was like an operator, depending on how you set up the signal chain, you could do FM synthesis or add classic additive synthesis. So I guess this is no FM, but this is with, this is with most FM. This is with all FM. Oh, it's still on, it's still modulating. Okay. So you have, so you have 3 oscillators. Oh, this, okay, let me. Oh, the sustain is really long. Or the release is really long. That's what it was. The release is really long. It's lingering after I played it. But if you want a little bit of the sound. The sound is getting intense. Yeah, it's a little hard. It's a little tricky to know what you've modulated because it'd be nice. There probably is some menu that shows all the things you've modulated. It's like in Ableton, you can just click it and you can quickly see what you've modulated, but you just have to look with your eyes to see.
I'm surprised you have to remember all that because of how many that you have the option to change. Like you have to remember each and every setting that you swiped.
That's true. That's true. I mean, the only way exactly the only way you can kind of even get close is by looking and clicking the thing, but then you still don't know what you've. Oh, I guess okay. I guess. Oh, you know what kind of helps you is that there's a red arrow here, showing that like this has been engaged.
Okay.
But then it's still like something to click. Like this is a tiny red arrow, and like there can be a lot of these.
If you have something like if you have something as powerful as this, other than presets, what reasons are there to get something that costs hundreds of dollars? Just curious. I don't know what the difference between like these type of VSTs are.
Honestly, I think I've been more of the philosophy that you really can do anything with like the most minimal setup possible. Like I don't know if there is a reason except like the convenience factor. Like they just make the interface. They have like the money and the time and like the intellectual property to like modify the existing designs they've already made, and they like something like this is just like predicated on a team, and like someone's like, oh, we should add FM, or like, oh, let's add wavetable, and like I think truthfully this is probably like the most power. This like blows any synthesizer that's in Ableton out of the water probably, because it can do all of those things. But maybe it can't do certain things because it doesn't have an additional envelope but yeah, I mean.
That makes sense. Like maybe some have like an additional oscillator. Like you can do one more oscillator on this one, and this one you can do a different type of FM routing. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question. But then, I wonder if there's a zoom. Oh, that's going to help. Oh, okay. Okay, this makes it easier to see. Oh,
that's way better.
I guess, I bet you maybe there's like a way to add more of these modules. Like maybe like you can add more modules. I don't know if that's.
Oh, it could be like a modular synth. You could just like take stuff out and put it in. That'd be kind of cool.
That'd be kind of cool. I wouldn't put it past these folks because I see all these empty slots here. I wonder if this is some way of, because I don't know. Like over here, it seems like this looks slightly different because you were saying.
Yeah, they have different ones for sure.
Yeah. Wow.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, this is gnarly. I wonder if
Miller would love this.
Yeah, he'd be like.
He's probably worked on this. It's probably his under his GitHub.
It's his alias right here, Serge. He's got so many different like names or I don't know. Yeah, he has so. I'm sure he would be all about this. Oh yeah, you can do all kinds of. There's like a effects sequencer I think over here. A step sequencer of effects that you can. Oh yeah, this is cool. You can. This is something you can do in Massive that you can do in Ableton.
Oh, that's kind of cool.
Yeah. So you can do interesting. It's like your but what is this modulating? Like I wonder. Oh. Wow. Oh, I see. Okay, this is. Oh, I see. This is like the different. Oh no, we're in a sequence. This is sequencer. Okay. Interesting. Oh, I see. We changed this from LFO to sequencer. And this used to be an LFO, but you could also make it a step sequencer. Instead of doing like a straight sinusoidal pattern, you could be like, I want it to go up and down in this weird traversal of ways. Or you can make it an envelope. You can actually. Oh, no way. So you can make this an envelope. Oh, this is so powerful. Okay, yeah. So, yeah, so you just have to change this LFO mode to. This is amazing. And then if you add automation on top of this, you can do so much extra stuff. Wow. Yeah, that is something else.
Catherine, if you were looking for something like a little more plug and play, I've used this one, and it's a lot of fun. You can get some cool noises out of that, and it might not be as intimidating. I mean, this one still has a bunch of knobs, and honestly, half the time on this one, I don't really. Sometimes you can't get what you want out of it, but sometimes you just turn stuff and it sounds cool.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. This one's fun, and then those two chorus modes. It's like the classic Juno chorus. It sounds
Yeah.
really good.
Ah, okay, great. Let's see.
And these people have a lot of this company actually has a lot of free plugins that are just a little fun to use. Like they have a vocoder and a sampler.
No kidding. Oh yeah, I guess the one thing about installing these things is to go to a specific directory where you have to go to like library audio, I think, plugins, and then no, actually I think there's a user library. So you have to go to library, audio, plugins, components, and then you have to drag this here.
Oh yeah, it has to be in the right folder or whatever.
It has to be in the right. It doesn't have. This one doesn't come with an automatic installer. Or no, maybe it does. This is oh no, this is an older version. Okay. So now if I rescan my Ableton.
This one looks pretty cool too. This one looks similar to the Ableton ones, just as like a graphical interface.
Oh, the one this one that you're talking about?
No, I sent another one, but it's the same people. It's called the Noisemaker.
Oh, okay.
It looks pretty cool too.
Let's see, Noisemaker. Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. This is one of the ones on that list. There was a list we were looking at. Okay, so this is cool.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Okay, great. And this one actually does have an installer. Trash. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, it's good to get familiar with all of these different paradigms of synthesis, because you might run into a hardware, an actual hardware unit where you have to mess around with controls like this. Like I've got a synthesizer that actually looks really similar to the one that Jarrett sent earlier. So actually, if I rescan these plugins, if you go here and I go to plugins and I rescan, I think those plugins will appear right here, Tal Noisemaker. So Tal Noisemaker.
My uncle is big into modular synthesis, so he's got like a table just full of these different modules, and he just swaps them out. It's so cool how far you can go with this sort of stuff.
Oh, it's amazing. It's getting so it's getting a lot less expensive now too with all the Behringer stuff, and
totally.
It's amazing. That's one thing I've been meaning to do a deeper dive in, but I know that it's like a consumptive sort of thing, so I'm like, oh man, am I ready to do it? There's Tom Erb teaches a class on modular stuff as well. Oh, look at that, nice. Okay, so this one, the levels of the different oscillators. So you have, ooh, okay. You can detune them a little bit. You can do a saw wave, you can do a pulse wave. Oh, you can do a sine wave as well. You can tune them. So this is just pure additive synthesis. This is really similar to analog. And then synth 2, interesting. Why do they call this synth 2? Well, I guess this goes through here, so you can have a quick attack. This is a filter. I wonder why I'm having trouble with filters. This is the kind of expecting the sound to work over time. Maybe it's not on. I'll have to do more investigation. But classic amplitude envelope. You want it to come in slower. Oh, is it because this is down? You have an LFO as well, so let's see. Okay, then you can modulate whatever you want. So you can modulate the filter. That's cool. Envelope editor. Yeah, this is great. This is really cool. And I'm gonna check out the other one too. Did it not? I can't seem to find the other one. What was that? What was the other one called? It was oh. Huh. Well, I think that you'll have some luck with these synths as well. This is very similar to the first synth that we talked about, so it'll be more straightforward to get a handle on. But yeah, the third synth, the other synth that we looked at is really good for that wavetable stuff. But yeah, this is great. Classic analog style kind of synthesizer.
Yeah, well, thank you for your help. I don't want to take too much more of your time because I know Garrett has a question.
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely. Yeah, my pleasure. I'll keep looking into this stuff. There's always more to learn, so I want to figure this out more myself. So just have fun with it. Like it's really cool.
Mm-hmm. And thank you, Garrett, for sharing the two things with us as well.
Yeah, no problem.
Cool.
Thank you, Nicole. I will see
Yeah.
you Thursday.
Yeah, see you soon. Good luck. Happy creating.
Thank you.
Jarrett, what's going on, man?
Hey, I just had a quick question regarding the last homework. Things got a little hectic in the Bay. I don't know if you heard. It just got a little.
Oh, yeah, I heard about that.
I'm okay personally, but it did kind of affect my motivation a bit. I think it was a little daunting, I guess. You know, like my grandparents got evacuated. It's just kind of crazy how big these fires got. You know, and I just was wondering if it would be okay to. I've been kind of playing around with these vocals that I've been playing around with them for almost the entire week. As soon as you announced the homework last week, I started playing around with these. You know, Crystal Castles.
Oh, I don't know if I do.
Crystal Castles. You may have heard their songs before, but one of the members or one of the ex-members, this girl named Alice Glass, and she's got these crazy icy vocals, and I've always wondered how she does them. And so I was trying to just play around with some vocals last week, but I just couldn't get. I couldn't get anywhere with these vocals at all, and I'm basically here a week later without much to show. Yesterday, I spent quite a bit of time looking into my first homework and trying to improve the drums. I mostly did that through compression and also gated reverb. I threw a gated reverb on the snare, and I tried to do it with the kicks too, but I felt like the kicks didn't benefit from that as much. So I was wondering if you'd be okay with me turning in for the second homework an improved version of the assignment that I turned in for the first homework.
Oh yeah, no problem. Yeah, I mean that's totally cool, and it's great that you're doing that. I didn't make that clear enough to a lot of students, I think, because